Welcome to The Crossing, Voices from the Lighthouse. Today we sit down with attorney Cari Pastor, an immigration lawyer with more than 35 years of experience, who has walked alongside the Lighthouse through countless challenges. For Cari, the law is more than a career. It's a vocation shaped by her own family's immigrant story and sustained by deep faith. Cari opens up about the realities of the asylum process, cutting through the myths and misinformation that cloud public understanding, and she names what's truly at stake for the families and children who come here seeking safety. Cari also speaks with candor about the brokenness of our immigration system, offers stories of both heartbreak and hope from the courtroom, and reflects on the faith that gives her strength to continue. Cari's words are both sobering and full of hope. Here's our conversation. Well, hello, Cari Pastor. It's wonderful to have you here today on our podcast. I've been waiting for this opportunity to have a chance to chat with you. So why don't you start by telling our listeners a little bit about you and about your work?
Okay, well, it's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So a little bit about me. I'm an immigration lawyer. I've been an immigration lawyer now for over 35 years. It is the only law that I practice because, of course, it's full time. It's very complicated. My parents were both from Cuba, and my mom came on a green card through work sponsorship, and my father actually fled and applied for asylum. He was detained when he got here, and after he won his asylum case, he was released. And that was during the revolution in Cuba in 1959. I have always kind of been dealing with immigration and, of course, interested in it. So that's kind of how I got into the field.
Sounds like it's something that's really close to your heart and something that you do really with passion and that you're really driven to do much more so than a job, just a regular job.
It is. And interestingly enough, at this age, I've been asked, am I thinking about retirement? And I always respond by saying, no, I just plan to drop dead in court, in immigration court someday.
Well, I hope that doesn't happen, but it's what the future will bring. Um,
Right.
yeah. So, do you specialize in any particular kind of immigration law?
So my firm, which the firm's been around for 20 years. So I started out at a nonprofit with the Catholic Church, their legal immigration program in Detroit. And then I went to a firm, a private firm for a few years. And then I started my own. And the firm does everything. I have associates that do business immigration, they do family immigration, but I specialize in litigation. So I do all the immigration court work. I do appeals. I do a lot of federal district court work, which during the first Trump administration and now that there's an increase in that. And I do federal appellate work. I actually just got back last week from a trial in the U.S. District Court regarding citizenship.
I see. Obviously, there's a lot of talk right now in the public and in the media about immigration and about the immigration challenges that we face in this country. And I think that there are some things that are really misunderstood. I'd like to start by asking you, because the Lighthouse, as you know, we focus on asylum seekers. So I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what that process looks like and whether people who are coming here as asylum seekers are quote unquote legal. I was wondering if you could sort of address the asylum seeking process in the United States and help people understand how does that work? What's the idea behind it and how does it actually work in practice?
That is a great question because, in fact, that's the area of immigration that's been most under attack recently, right? Because there's all sorts of misinformation about it. So the history of it comes from international law. It comes from a time when Hitler was in power and there was Jewish people that were trying to come to the United States and they were denied. And once they're back, and we kind of pretty much know how awful that was. So after that, the U.S. decided that we need to welcome people that are seeking asylum, that are going to be persecuted and tortured. And that was eventually codified in the Immigration and Nationality Act. And a lot of it kind of tracks what the UN Committee on Refugee and the treaties have said. So that's where the law comes from. I guess the most important, at least I think the most important part of the law is something called non-refoulement, which is if a person is facing persecution, then we are not going to send them back to that place where they will be persecuted. Now, that law has evolved and there's, a lot of case law on it and regulations and so forth. So the process is person can either come to the port of entry, which would be, wherever you would normally enter the United States, a bridge, a tunnel, a land border, and you would apply for asylum. A lot of people don't do it that way simply because a lot of port of entries will turn the person around and say, oh, you can't do that. I've heard people being told go to the consulate, and consulates don't accept asylum applications. So you can't do that. So a lot of people will cross in, and then once they're in, they will either turn themselves over to Border Patrol, or they will get to wherever they're going in the United States and then apply for asylum. There is nothing illegal about that, despite what we're hearing. That is the way it's supposed to be done, either at a port of entry or once you cross through and you turn yourself in to ICE, or usually it's Customs and Border Protection at the ports of entry, and you request asylum. That is perfectly fine. Now, the way that it's worked in the past, the person is detained, asked a couple of questions about why they're afraid, and then they are paroled into the country, so released into the country under parole, so that they can go to United States Citizenship and Immigration Services and apply for asylum. And that's known as affirmative asylum. Other times, and more recently, under both the Biden administration and I believe the Obama administration, what was happening is people were coming in, they were being asked a series of very few questions. During Biden administration, almost no questions at all. And then they were released and put in immigration proceedings in immigration court to apply for asylum in court. So that was the other way. While, whether you're applying with USCIS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or the immigration court, you are allowed to remain in the United States. And after 150 days that you submitted your application and it's pending, then you can apply for work authorization. So all of these things are done to help the person seeking refuge. And they will have their day either before USCIS or in immigration court to prove their case, to prove whether they are persecuted and whether they are persecuted on a basis that is recognized under the law, which religion, ethnicity, race, political opinion, those types of things. So there are, I believe, 5 categories. If you fit into one of those and you can prove that you were persecuted and you can prove that you fear persecution and that there's nowhere within your home country that you can move to, then you would be granted asylum. Asylum is discretionary. The discretion part is very big now, both at USCIS and immigration court. So you have to show that you've paid your taxes, that you don't have any criminal convictions, things like that. Basically, that you have behaved while you're here, that you're a good person, and that, yes, you will be persecuted if you return. And that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. How does that differ from a refugee? Because we hear about refugees as well. So what's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker?
Okay, so under the law, a refugee is someone that's been processed overseas. Okay, so that might be what we hear about, the big displacements, the war in Syria, for example, right? And so people left. They would then go to a UN refugee camp or office, and they would apply for status there. So the UN would maybe recognize them as a refugee, and then there are nonprofits. And I can only speak to the U.S. because I don't know how they handle it in other countries, but obviously the UN deals with all different countries. But in the U.S., there are several nonprofits that have applied to receive refugees. So when I was working for the Catholic Church in Detroit, we also had a refugee division. And what would happen is we would say, these are the numbers of families that we can take. And I remember back in those days, which was the 90s, we would take over 1,000 families a year. And so once that person is recognized as a refugee, once one of the nonprofits has accepted them, they will then come to the United States. Everything's paid for, right? Their flight, everything else. And then once they get here, that nonprofit it used to be, again, with federal funds, I'm not sure how they do it now, would find housing, would help them find work. And then they had a stipend, I believe, for the first 6 months, a small stipend, depending on how many people were in a family. And so it was the nonprofit's job to relocate them, help them find work, get them into English classes, help them open bank accounts, things like that. And so they already come in with a status. as opposed to an asylum seeker that really comes in without a status and then is requesting asylum.
Right. And that's the very reason that the Lighthouse exists, right? Is that we recognize that people, once they're released from detention and are in especially that vulnerable period before that 150 days has passed and they are eligible for their work papers and their social security numbers to even be able to pay taxes, they're in a very vulnerable state. Is that a fair statement?
That is a very fair statement because unlike the refugee program, the asylum program does not have any of those safeguards. There isn't a program to help them find work. There's no program to help them find where to learn English. There's no one to teach them how to open a bank account or how to rent a place or sign a lease or anything like that. So all of those safeguards that a refugee has is not available to an asylum seeker. So an organization like Lighthouse is extremely crucial in those first few months when an asylum seeker is released and is able to apply for asylum.
It's really just it's so much to even think about and consider what people are facing in these situations. You know many stories, I know many stories, from walking with people on their journeys. I guess that raises the question for me because, 130 people have come through the Lighthouse in the 8 years that we've been running, and we've been able to house them and provide all the services and the safeguards that you were just mentioning. They have been, very hardworking, appreciative, earnest, and I have been just so impressed by their integrity and their faith, and their appreciation for this country is really it's quite impressive, and their commitment to work hard. And that is just so counter to the messages that we're hearing in the media. There's sort of a very wide paintbrush, being crossed over folks and saying, they're all criminals or they're all this, they're just sending us dangerous people and things like that. What do you have to say? How do we speak to that narrative? How do we speak truth into that narrative?
Well, as all media, you take the sensationalism because that's what people watch and that's what people sell. So you take the few that have committed a crime or that were deported because they committed crimes and have somehow re-entered. And you focus on that and say, well, everybody's like that. Everybody is that person, right? So to me, it reminds me a lot of racism, right? Where you take a group of people and because they're different, you categorize every person in that specific category, whether it's religion or race or whatever, as, whatever stereotype you want to put, lazy or criminals or shysters or whatever. And that's what's happening with asylum seekers as a group, right? They'll take the one or two that, are breaking the laws or murdering or whatever, right? Bad things that they're doing. And you say, now they're all like that. And that's not true. By and far, the majority of asylum seekers are people actually fleeing persecution, whether we recognize it under the law or not, the type of persecution that they're feeling, they are still feeling that persecution, right? And there's trauma and all sorts of things that come along with that. So I think that the most overlooked service is the mental health service because trauma, and I see that every day when I have people come in and I'm interviewing them, it takes months to establish a connection with an asylum seeker where I'm getting the full story. Sometimes even a year. I've had clients that have been my clients for 1 or 2 years, and then all of a sudden the story actually comes out. And they're crying in the tears because, you want to forget. You want to put aside everything that's happened to you that was bad. These are traumatized people who are trying to get their lives back together. They're doing the best they can. One of the biggest questions I get is, when can I get my employment authorization? When can I get my employment authorization? Because they want to work. They don't want to be robbing people. They don't want to be, selling drugs or whatever it is. They honestly want to work. They want to better their lives. The ones that have children, I want my kids to go to school. They really want to be good members of the American society. They appreciate what this government's doing in the past. It's a little different now, but they really want to be here. And what I see right now is a lot of questions as to why are we being detained when we're fleeing from being detained in our home countries and being tortured. One story that I can remember was a woman from the Middle East, and she came in to apply for asylum, and they were going to detain her until they figured out her story. And she looked at me as they were taking her away, and she said, "Please don't let them put me in a dungeon and beat me." because that's what she had suffered back home. Here we are, instead of protecting her, we're throwing her in a jail. It's not a dungeon and she's not going to be beaten, but the trauma is there and the trauma is real.
Yes. I mean, I've had people say, "I'm not a criminal." Like, they're in detention and they're wearing a jumpsuit and they're saying, "I'm not a criminal." If anything, they're escaping violence, they're escaping
Exactly.
persecution, they're
Exactly.
escaping drug cartels. That's the last
Exactly.
thing they wanna be involved with here.
Right.
Um,
Exactly.
I wanna pick up on something you just said about, things have changed, right? There has definitely
Yes.
been a quantum shift, in this work that we do and in this world, and I know at the Lighthouse, I am definitely seeing among current guests and former guests highly increased levels of anxiety, just real fear about, being out in public. I've had people tell me they're afraid to speak in public because they don't want people to hear their accent and then they would be identified as other. Are you seeing this? What kinds of things are you noting, changes in the past several months?
I'm spending a lot more time on the phone than I was in the past, as is all of my staff, my paralegals and everybody, kind of dealing with people's anxieties, where in the past somebody would come in or call and you would say, okay, this is what needs to be done and whatever. Now we're dealing with the emotional consequences. Am I going to be arrested? If I file something, am I going to be detained? Will they come at my employer's place and, will they be allowed in? Will they come to my home and pull me out in front of my children? So a lot of it right now is just having that empathy to listen and advise them as best as you can and to be there. And like I said, the federal lawsuits are increasing. I had a gentleman from Cuba who isn't accepting, people that are being sent back, pending asylum application, married to a U.S. citizen. When the immigration judge had given us time so that he could have his marriage interview to see if we can do the green card in court, in addition to his asylum. And I get to Detroit to do my citizenship trial. And that very first day, my associate had gone with him for the marriage interview with his wife, and they pulled him and arrested him out of the marriage interview for no reason, no criminal record, nothing at all. You can imagine, I'm in trial. I can't get to them right away. My associate's trying to calm everybody down. When I'm done with the trial and I get to my office in Troy, Michigan, the wife, the cousin, the in-laws, everybody's sitting there crying. What did I do? I had to jump into federal court and file a habeas to get him released because there was no reason for him to be detained. So that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing families torn apart for no reason whatsoever. So that's a huge change, right? Because before, you could go to a marriage interview, you didn't have to worry about it. And we hear the stories about people being arrested at ICE check-ins or in immigration court. Same thing. You could do what you were supposed to do, which is check in, so they don't mark you as a fugitive. You go to court, so you're not deported without being there and getting all the penalties that go along with that and not being able to get a green card when that happens. And instead of having your day in court or getting your USCIS interview, you can be arrested for no reason. Because unlike what we hear in the media that, oh, we're arresting the worst of the worst, it's not true. And we've seen Thomas Holmes, I think, is the ISAR, and Secretary Noem say, oh, we're going after the worst of the worst, but then also adding, well, if you're here without documentation or you entered illegally, then that's a crime. And so everybody's the worst of the worst, right?
Right, which goes back to what we started with are you really entering illegally when it is a legal process to seek your asylum here, right?
Exactly.
So it gets so convoluted so quickly, I think, and so difficult for people to keep track of. But I think it is true that we have been seeing people, as you've just said, who have status. They're waiting for their day in court, right? And my feeling is if we're going to give somebody their day in court, we need to protect them and make sure they can survive to get that day in court, right? So you have your day in court. You've already fled all this persecution. You've been re-traumatized entering here. We haven't even gotten into the dangers of the journey that many people
Right.
face, right? And the traumas that they
Absolutely.
re-experience there. And now you're just trying to work to put food on the table and take care of your children. And you're afraid that you might get arrested at work because you've heard of that happening, or you're afraid to go in and do your ICE check-in because you might get arrested there. And so in some ways, it's almost counterproductive, right? We want the people who are in the process to comply with the process 100%. And certainly, that's so important to us at the Lighthouse. But it's hard to see this happen. So I guess my next question is, what keeps you up at night?
Lots of things keep me up at night right now. What's going to happen to my clients? Am I going to wake up tomorrow morning and get 5 calls that 5 of my clients have been arrested? For example, what's been happening recently is I'm getting a lot of calls from spouses that their spouse has been detained when they've gone for a check-in or they've gone to court. What can I do? I don't know where that person is. How do I find them? Is there anything that can be done? Most recently, I had a call from a woman who lives in Houston, and her husband was picked up by ICE just driving to work. And when I looked into it, there is actually a federal order out there preventing people in his specific situation from being arrested. So ICE is violating the order. So, you have to jump in and deal with that, whether that's going to court and saying, hey, they're violating an order. I always try to call ICE first and say, hey, but if I can't get anywhere, then court's the alternative. And the issue with that is it's very expensive. And the nonprofits that are doing it are already, up to their ears in work. So I think that, that's the issue too, is like the only way to protect people right now is going into court, and court's expensive.
Right. That's a very good point. Can you talk to us a little bit about, what does it cost ballpark for an individual or a family to be represented and to have, representation in court, and how much greater are their chances of receiving their asylum if they have representation versus not? Because in theory, one can do it alone, right? In theory, one can fill out the asylum application and can just go through the process. But I really wonder about the win rates, the difference between those.
So Syracuse University is very good at compiling statistics and data, not only for represented to unrepresented, for countries, where people coming from that are getting asylum mostly, but for each individual immigration judge in each court. So I think if I recall their study, I think it was like 18% that are unrepresented that actually get granted. If you're not represented, you're going to get denied, right? So that's an issue. Like I said, the nonprofits have always traditionally, even when I worked at a nonprofit, we just can't handle the volume that comes in, unfortunately. And of course, there is no government paid right to a lawyer. You have a right to a lawyer as long as you pay for it yourself. So if you cannot get a nonprofit attorney and you have to hire a private one, it's going to cost several thousands of dollars to get good representation. Because that's the other thing. You want good representation. You want, somebody who's putting in the evidence, who's preparing you before you go to court, things like that. So, and that's time consuming and it's expensive. So that does limit the amount of people that can get representation. If we're talking about federal court, which of course is much more expensive than immigration court, what I'd like to do is group people together so we can spread the cost around, right? Because instead of paying, and I'm just, every case is different, so I can't say this is what we charge, and every lawyer charges differently also. So to just throw out a number, if I'm going to charge $10,000 for a federal case, but I have 10 people with the same kind of issue, that's $1,000 per person, which is much more manageable than 10,000 per person. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now, because that's kind of how we have to do it. We have to group people together to protect people's rights so that they can afford it, right? But I also, I get up in the morning and I look at what the nonprofits are doing to see if there's an order that's already been, or a group that's already challenging a specific thing. And, if somebody calls or I have a client that can fit in there, it's like, hey, go to this group, sign up because you can be included in that lawsuit, so why reinvent the wheel? Why pay? But again, nonprofits only have a certain capacity. They do class actions, which is, more feasible. And there's just a certain capacity of how many of those they can take.
Could you maybe just tell us about one asylum case, just so we can get a picture of, what was the situation, what were the challenges, a successful outcome, and then maybe an outcome that wasn't successful, just to give people an idea of what kinds of cases are actually winning asylum and what kinds of cases are getting weeded out in the process?
I've had cases where I've said, oh, there's no way this case is going to win. Not because it's weak, but maybe we don't have a ton of evidence, which is normal in asylum. I always say the persecutor doesn't hand you a note saying, hey, I want to persecute you because you're, Christian or you're Muslim or whatever. They don't do that, right? So maybe they don't have, or the client, even though they've been prepped, is not a great witness or whatever. And you think you're going to lose, or you have a judge that has like a 2% grant rate, right? And you're like, that's it. But those have won. And then there are others where I think, oh no, this is a surefire winner, and they end up losing. So there's no one thing that I could say, if they have this, that, and the other thing, they're going to win, right? And if they don't have this, that, and the other thing, they're going to lose, because there's a lot of different variables, right? So we try to put the best case together, as much evidence as possible, and things like that. A successful case that comes to mind is at a case of a student who was from a Middle Eastern country, and they came in for a competition in their area, and they met with congressmen in the state that they were in and all of that, and held up the flag of resistance of that country as opposed to the country flag. So, of course, they could not go back. And they wanted to apply for asylum, but ICE detained them. And so he was in jail at the time. And when I got the case, like, you're not going to get out, bond was already denied. You want to fight your case? It's going to take several months. And of course, yeah. Because they knew darn well that if they went back to that home country, they were going to be jailed, tortured, and eventually killed just for holding the flag of the resistance group. So I thought this was going to be tough. And I explained to them, we've got a judge that isn't that great, and we're probably going to have to appeal it. So I'm just going to make the record for the appeal, blah, blah, blah. And they were fine. They were willing to stay, however it took 8 months, if there's an appeal, to a year. And we went to court, presented the evidence. They testified. We presented pictures of them holding up the flag and stuff, and granted and released the very next day. So that was great. And that process was, again, they were detained. So everything had to be done from the detention center, go out there, fill out the asylum forms. They didn't have any family here. So that was tough, because a lot of times it's the family that we ask for the evidence. So they didn't have that, but they did have their pictures, and they had their identity documents, which is very important to show who you are and where you're from. And we were able to put together a lot of articles about what was going on and what was happening to resistance members and things like that. Get them for their testimony, what things are going to be asked and things like that, so that they're not nervous when they get in there. And that person did a wonderful job, and we got it. So that was an awesome case, because you knew that they were not going to be put in jail, tortured, and killed, and they could stay here and continue with the studies that they were doing, and live a good and safe life.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story.
Yes. One that I've lost. Domestic violence is one of the hardest asylum type cases to win, just because it's just hard to fit under the current state of the law. You have to fit them in a particular social group.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of judges don't see that particular social group as is defined, which is a very tough definition to me. And so this person had been abused by her partner for years, managed to escape, had, pictures of when she was beat up, had the children who were older testify of what they saw their mom go through and how they too were beaten, had some hospital reports, and testified as best as they could, given the trauma. Did not go see a psychologist here, which I highly recommend. But again, part culture, part I don't want to relive it. So, you get it. And it was one of those cases where, you want to just cry listening to it.
Yeah.
And watching that person have to repeat everything. And at the end, the judge said, well, I believe that all that happened to you, but you just don't fit in the law, so I'm going to deny it. And then send her back to the abuser, basically.
Mm-hmm. That's really hard. I'm sure those are the ones that you don't get a good night's sleep after something like
Right.
that, for sure.
Right. And you never forget. I remember one I had in 1990 that involved children and a mom, and that still haunts me to this day.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing that I think people don't realize, that more than half of the asylum seekers are children, right? And so we're this is really, a world in which children are right at the center and really need to be protected.
Right. Whether it's from abusive parents or gang recruitment or recruitment into, hostilities or wars or whatever, all of that, how they're being treated in schools. And the asylum system is not set up for children at all, especially if they don't have they're unaccompanied, right? So they have no one to help them. They don't understand the system. And I do not represent children because it's too taxing. I can't do it. Emotionally, I can't handle it. So I have not looked at those statistics, but I'll bet you that even with representation, the unaccompanied children getting asylum is extremely low.
And the ones that we lose in the process, in one way or another,
Mhm.
is, I'm sure, very high. Speaking of children, we all remember the time when children were separated from their parents at the border and records were not kept in all cases. I understand there are still many children who have never been reunited with their parents from that time period.
That's what I've heard also.
Is that something that we could face again?
Yes. Yes. I think we can face it again. I unfortunately see this administration is having very little empathy for asylum seekers or keeping families together. So yes, I think that could happen again. And whenever you separate children from parents and put them into a big system like that, I mean, we know in the foster care system, they can't keep track. And that's a system that's been around for ages and has a lot of, in terms of workers and things like that, even though they are, understaffed, it's still a lot bigger than the unaccompanied minor program that the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they run that, has,
Mhm.
or the capability to track them. So yes, I see that coming up again.
If you could wave a magic wand and change one part of the system as it stands, and let's talk about for asylum seekers because that's really what we're talking about today. What would that change be and why?
There are so many things, it's hard to pick one, right? I mean, first, I make sure that unaccompanied children had the right to counsel paid by the government,
Mhm.
because you can't expect kids to get money to do this. 5-year-olds are not, despite what Border Patrol has said in the past, 5-year-olds do not come to the United States to work. I think that would be one thing. The other is the particular social group definition in the asylum laws. That's almost impossible to meet. We don't require in any of the other groups things like social visibility, nexus, or anything like that. So to the standard, we do require nexus, but not to the standard that we require in a particular social group. So I would change the particular social group definition to be more in line with the rest of the categories. And like I said, there's so many. When you ask that question, my head is just spinning with so many things. So those are the two that just popped out in front.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all agree that our immigration system needs reform. There's a lot of focus on how terrible it's been, but it's been terrible for a long, long time, right? This is a system that has been broken for a long time, and you know every administration and both political parties have their share of culpability in that. I kind of resist conversations where people want to paint it as, one side's problem, or, things happened under this administration and paint it like it was all great before. I think it's been really difficult. And I think, as you say, it's a huge system to be able to manage just the volume of people and the complexity of issues. But from a humanitarian standpoint, is an incredibly tall order.
Correct. And I think you can look at any administration from, I think it's 1947 or 49 when we did the first immigration set of laws. And ever since then, and point to something that administration could have done better, shouldn't have done, could have done. I mean, there isn't one administration that you could say, oh, yeah, under that was a great administration because every administration has done bad things and good things.
Right.
Even the current one, I know people are going to disagree with me, but there are good things that they've done in terms of immigration. But there's a lot of bad things that they've done, and the bad is always going to outweigh the good when you're dealing with humanitarian issues.
Yeah. So, Cari, I know that you are a person of great faith. We've had that conversation in the past, and you, of course, know that the Lighthouse is a ministry of the Episcopal Church. And so, I guess my question for you is, what role does your faith play in the work that you do? How does it inform your work in any way?
I draw that on all the time. I am a lawyer thanks to God. My family had no money. They came with nothing from Cuba, even though my mom was from a very poor family in Cuba, and she did come here with a work visa. But, back in those days, it was different. She didn't come to work as head of GM or something. She came to work in a factory. And my dad, of course, came with nothing, being an asylum seeker. And I got to go to NYU on a full scholarship. And that would have never happened. I couldn't have paid for law school. And I wouldn't have taken out a loan because that just wasn't something my family permitted or I would have done. I just wasn't raised that way. So I'm a lawyer through the grace of God that I was able to get that opportunity to go to a great school and not pay a penny. So that's how it all started, right? And every time that I have a hearing, an immigration hearing or federal court, I look towards God and try to say, what do I need to do here?
Mm-hmm.
And just let him guide.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So God and the Holy Spirit is definitely at the heart of your work, it sounds like.
Oh, yes, very much so.
So, Cari, anytime we put the news on today, there's any number of just challenging, horrible, scary, cruel things that are happening. I think it's very easy for someone to tune out. I've heard many people say, I just don't listen to the news anymore. People feel like they're no longer getting just the news, but they're getting sort of one team's sort of sensationalized view of what's happening. So I guess my question is for people who really want to know the truth, number one, but more importantly, also want to do something, want to feel that they have something that they can do other than stand by and feel helpless. I mean, what do you recommend that somebody, what can they do in this environment at this time with the reality being what it is?
Well, first thing is to be there for our neighbors, to listen, to empathize with the anxiety that they're going through. I think that's super important. The second is joining peaceful demonstrations and holding our officials accountable. Once a year through the Federal Bar Association, I do lobbying, and we call it Capitol Hill Day. And we go around and we talk to senators and congressmen about the issues that are going on. Now, those are not necessarily immigration issues, different organization. But when I was there, I was surprised to see a lot of different groups that I never even knew existed lobbying. And I think that's important. And you don't have to be with any group. You can go by yourself, but of course, numbers is better. But get a group of concerned people together and go in and explain to your senators and your representatives at the federal level what's going on. Because a lot of times they don't know what's going on down, in Jersey City or in Edison. They are not, they're either watching some of the news or having somebody scream for them. And as we know, the news is going to bring up the sensationalism, right? What is actually going on in the ground? Is ICE standing at an urgent care clinic? Because we've had that happen in the past, right? Years ago. They didn't know anything about it. But you bring the pictures, you talk to them, and what you're seeing, give them picture of what one individual person is going through and how that's affecting other people.
Mm-hmm.
And how that one individual, what they're going through, isn't an isolated incident.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening a lot. I think that's important. And then again, holding our officials accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I think those are the three important things: empathy, peaceful protest, holding our officials accountable.
Mm. If only more people were doing that instead of shouting into the echo chamber,
Oh,
uh,
so true.
fears and their frustrations. So Thank you so much. I'll ask just before we leave if there's anything else that you think people need to know that I haven't asked about, that would be good for us to know given this context.
So what I always say is don't lose hope. And it's easier said than done, especially when you're detained or you have a family member detained. But, fight for your rights, especially if you're detained. Don't give up. I know it's difficult. It breaks my heart whenever I go visit a client in jail, to see adults crying. It's tough, but don't give up because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And if we all stick together, we can accomplish great things. So don't lose hope. That would be the big one.
I love it. I think that's really important. I try to live my life that way. And I know doing this work gives me great hope, actually. So I have great hope for humanity. And despite the situation that we're in, maybe it's a good thing we're going through. Maybe it will expose some of the areas that really need to be reformed and where we need to be more intentional and where we really need to make sure that we are taking care of our neighbor and loving our neighbor as we're supposed to. So as we're called to. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Cari. Thank you for the amazing work that you do, representing those who are really vulnerable and who have been marginalized and who really need a great advocate like you by their side. And thank you for all the support you give to the Lighthouse as well. It's been just so great having you in to do a Know Your Rights training with our guests and to be able to have our questions answered when we need them. So I can't thank you enough for being such a wonderful friend to the Lighthouse and to so many.
Well, thank you. The Lighthouse does tremendous work, and it would be great to see it grow and expand and continue the great work that it's doing and the support it's providing for the vulnerable people. Thank you again for having me here. I've enjoyed this, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Crossing, Voices from the Lighthouse. Today, attorney Cari Pastor reminded us that asylum seekers are not criminals or statistics. They are people fleeing persecution who want nothing more than to work, raise their children, and live in safety. Cari spoke of the trauma they carry, the fear they live with, and the desperate need for representation and support. She also spoke of hope rooted in faith, in community, and in the power of ordinary people to listen, to stand alongside, to hold leaders accountable, and to refuse to look away. For every listener who wonders, what can I possibly do? Start small. Offer empathy. Learn the truth. Stand with a neighbor. Trust that even these simple acts matter. I'm Deacon Jill Singleton. We'll be back soon with more voices and more stories. In the meantime, please share this podcast with friends and consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. To learn more about the Lighthouse, visit lighthousenj.org. Until next time, peace be with you.